The usual saying in Dynasty is buy low and sell high, but sometimes it just makes sense to sell low on players who are declining before they completely fall off and become dead assets. So I have 3 players that I want to get out on now before their values tank into nothingness. First on the list, and the biggest name on the list, is Alvin Kamara, the current RB18 in November DLF ADP. Now, the time to sell Kamara was actually this time last year, where he was still being valued as a first-round Dynasty asset in 1 quarterback leagues, but has since fallen precipitously in the years since, down to now the end of the 4th round, and I would expect that to continue following, especially when the season ends, because we will be looking at a 27.5-year-old running back coming off the worst fantasy season of his career. And that's honestly one of the biggest pitfalls for justifying having Alvin Kamara right now, is that he is a win now player. Obviously, if you're rebuilding, Kamara has no place on your roster, but I would argue that even as a contender, you shouldn't really want Kamara either. He's the current RB14 in PPR scoring, averaging 16.5 points per game, which is still very good, but it's not elite, and it's not Alvin Kamara either. Ramondre Stevenson and Tony Pollard are both averaging over 16 points per game. Even Jamal Williams is sitting at 15.5, and Kamara's production is just not game-changing for you this year. On the season, Kamara has had under 12 rush attempts in 5 of his 9 games, plus 3 or fewer receptions in another 5 games. He's also only scored 3 touchdowns so far, and actually all of them came in the same game back in week 8. But since that week, he's been horrible, averaging under 10 carries a game, just 32 rushing yards a game, plus only 4 targets and 3 receptions per game. Then you take a look at his schedule. He gets the Niners this week, 2nd hardest defense for running backs on the season. Tampa Bay next week, 3rd hardest defense for running backs. Then he has a bye in week 14. Honestly, the only saving grace for Kamara are 2 great matchups to start the fantasy playoffs, and then a middle-of-the-pack matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles in the championship. But those games only matter if you get to the playoffs, which he hasn't helped you to do over the last 3 weeks, and it doesn't look like he's going to help you over the next 3 weeks either. So why are you holding on to Alvin Kamara? I would be desperately trying to package him with a second or something to go and get Derrick Henry or Nick Chubb, or can you go to a Ramondre Stevenson, a Dameon Pierce, even a Najee Harris, who has a fantastic playoff schedule and is starting to produce very recently. Worst case scenario, just give me a 1st round pick, even if you're competing, and I'll figure things out down the stretch. The point is, get rid of Alvin Kamara before his value completely tanks in January and beyond in 2023. Another player similar to Kamara, just worse in basically every aspect, is Leonard Fournette, who is literally losing his job right before our eyes. At least with Kamara, you don't have to worry about a better player behind him taking his job, unless you still believe in David Johnson. But with Leonard Fournette, that's a legitimate concern, because Rachaad White is actually a better player, and the Buccaneers are starting to see it now too. Just like Kamara, Fournette also had a couple big games about a month ago, and again, just like Kamara, has been horrible since then, averaging 10 carries a game, under 3 receptions a game, and only 50 total yards per game since week 7. Thankfully, though, he scored twice in that stretch, which has really saved a couple of his fantasy weeks, including that game back in Germany. But the writing is on the wall for the end of Fournette as a major fantasy contributor, and I don't want to be caught holding the bag on him to end the season. I would love to turn Fournette into his own teammate, Rachaad White, or can you get either Washington running back in Brian Robinson or Antonio Gibson? I'd prefer David Montgomery, Isaiah Pacheco, Devin Singletary, and Jamal Williams for the rest of this season if you're competing. Even honestly, I'll take J.K. Dobbins in Dynasty, because at least he's 4 years younger there and you have a bit more time before the collapse in his case. Just don't be stuck with Leonard Fournette by the time January hits. And the last player that I just want to get rid of right now is Courtland Sutton, who has just done nothing compared to my expectations of him prior to this season, which I guess none of the Broncos have really lived up to expectations, but Sutton in particular, because at least Jerry Jeudy has had a couple of games this year as a high-end fantasy wide receiver 2, and then a couple more just regular wide receiver 2 weeks. Sutton hasn't had a game yet inside the top 15 and only 3 total games inside the top 25. Let me show you a blind comparison right now between Sutton and another receiver with similar receptions, yards, and touchdowns on basically 20 fewer targets on the season. I'll give you like 3 seconds to guess who this other player is. It's Donovan Peoples-Jones, the wide receiver 2 on the Cleveland Browns for Jacoby Brissett. That's how uninspiring Sutton's production has been this year. We just don't feel it as much, I think, because it's Courtland Sutton. There's still that name value attached to him. In November ADP, Sutton is valued as the wide receiver 35, which is right in line basically with his production and actually one spot behind Jerry Jeudy. but he's going ahead of guys like Christian Kirk, Juju Smith-Schuster, Mike Williams, Jacoby Myers, Rondale Moore, Allen Lazard. These are all guys that I would much rather have than Courtland Sutton because they're either younger, they're producing better, or in some cases both. He's also not far behind guys like Brandon Ayuk, Treylon Burks, Gabe Davis, Hollywood Brown. Again, all guys that I would prefer much more to Courtland Sutton. And if it's easy for you to make that pivot, I would be doing that in a heartbeat. And if you're interested in one more player to get out on right now in Dynasty, Justin actually highlights another one in this video right up here.